The auction house at Rio Flats smelled like hot iron cattle fear and decisions made too fast. That morning in late May, every rancher in Concho County had driven in from 3 directions. Trucks dusted pale from Caleche roads, boots already darkened from heat, soaking through leather before 9 in the morning. They came for the same thing they always came for now: size, muscle. The kind of genetics that looked impressive in photographs and sold calves heavy enough to brag about at feed stores through November. Nobody came expecting to watch a 68-year-old widow change everything they believed about the future of their land, but she was already there when most of them arrived. Willa Donovan sat 6 rows back from the auction ring wearing a faded denim shirt she had owned since before most of the younger ranchers in that barn had started shaving. She held a battered composition notebook across her lap. Not a tablet, not a phone. A notebook filled with 44 years of her husband's handwriting that nobody had thought to ask about. Sitting quietly beside her was her son Wyatt, 40 years old, jaw set tight, the way men hold their faces when they are trying not to look embarrassed by the person sitting next to them. By noon, that same son would wish he had been paying attention to the notebook instead of the crowd. Now, let me take you back a little, because you cannot understand what happened at that auction without understanding the woman who walked into it. And you cannot understand Willa Donovan without understanding the land she came from and the man who taught her to read it. Cracked Stone Ranch sat 14 miles southwest of Barnhart on a stretch of Concho County where the earth turned pale and hard in summer, and the mesquite trees grew low and twisted the way everything grows. When it has spent generations fighting for every inch of moisture, the ranch had been in the Donovan family for 61 years. Earl Donovan's father bought the original 800 acres in 1963. And Earl had added 240 more over the course of his working life, one careful purchase at a time, never borrowing more than the land could carry back in a bad year. Earl understood something most modern ranchers had started forgetting. The land does not owe you anything. Every acre you hold is a promise you are making not to a bank, not to a market, but to the ground itself. He was a quiet man, tall and lean, with hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of fence work and difficult calving seasons and pulling stuck machinery out of creek mud. He kept notebooks the way other men kept money, carefully, consistently. Over 44 years of ranching, Earl Donovan had filled notebook after notebook with observations about everything the land told him, if he stayed still long enough to hear it. Rainfall totals going back to 1979. Calving records organized by cow and by season. Grass recovery rates after drought years. Heat indexes and their specific effect on breeding behavior. Water consumption patterns during consecutive dry months. Breeding outcomes broken down by body condition at the time of breeding. Not because he was sentimental about record keeping, because he was paying attention to something most of his neighbors were too busy or too comfortable to watch. Willa had married Earl at 22 on a Sunday afternoon in late October, and she had spent the next 46 years learning to see land the way he saw it, not as a commodity, not as something to leverage, as a living system with its own memory and its own patience and its own ways of rewarding people who respected those things. When Earl died of a heart attack one August morning 4 years ago, while riding fence near the south boundary, Willa did not sell the ranch. She did not deed it over to her son officially. She simply kept walking the same pastures, drinking coffee before sunrise from the same metal thermos, and reading the notebooks her husband had left behind on the same shelf where he had kept them for decades. She had not opened the ranch safe since the afternoon of Earl's funeral. That detail matters. Hold on to it. Wyatt Donovan had spent 12 years as a civil engineer in San Antonio before his father died. He was competent and careful and comfortable in a world where problems had calculable solutions. When he came back to Cracked Stone after Earl passed, he arrived with spreadsheets, loan proposals, market analysis from a livestock consultant in Midland, and a sincere belief that modern management principles could solve whatever the ranch was facing. He loved his mother absolutely. He also believed with the patient certainty of a man who trusts data that her approach to ranching was going to destroy everything his father spent a lifetime building. They had argued about it 3 times in 4 years, each time ending the same way. Willa reading at the kitchen table without looking up. Wyatt standing at the door unable to decide between staying and leaving. Neither of them saying what was really sitting in the room with them, which was fear wearing the costume of disagreement. The financial pressure that Spring was real and specific. Cracked Stone was not in crisis, not technically, but it was running thin in the way that ranch operations run thin before they become crises slowly and quietly, and without a single dramatic moment to point to later. 4 years of careful management since Earl's death had kept the operation intact, but had not grown it. Hay costs had climbed 2 consecutive years. The water system needed significant repair after an unexpected failure the previous winter. And the breeding herd, while healthy, was smaller and less aggressive-looking by contemporary standards than most operations the same acreage in Concho County. First Prairie Agricultural Bank held Cracked Stone's operating line. The loan officer assigned to their account was Jeffrey Keller, 45 years old, a man who wore pressed shirts to ranch visits and drove a truck that stayed clean regardless of which roads he used to reach, which gates. He had a practiced smile and a folder that always seemed slightly too full of papers for whatever conversation he claimed to be there for. He had been calling more frequently since February. Now let me tell you about the other man you need to understand before the auction begins, because every story about quiet wisdom getting mocked requires someone doing the mocking. And Concho County had exactly the right man for that particular role. Brock Steele was 52 years old, and he had built Steele Summit Cattle Company from almost nothing over 23 years of aggressive decisions, expensive genetics, and a talent for working rooms. The way certain men work rooms without seeming to be working them at all. He drove a new truck every 14 months. He wore starched pearl snap shirts to cattle auctions in 100-degree heat. He had appeared in 3 regional livestock magazine profiles over the past 6 years, and he kept frame copies of all 3 in the office at Steele Summit, between the window and the door where anyone who came to see him would notice them. What none of those magazine profiles ever mentioned was where Brock Steele actually came from. He grew up 40 miles north of Barnhart in a 3-room frame house on a failed dryland cotton operation his grandfather had started, and his father had tried to hold together through the worst drought years the region had seen in half a century. His father, Reed Steele, was a decent and hard-working man who got broken slowly by 2 consecutive drought years in the early 1980s, when commodity prices collapsed without warning, and the bank called the operating note with 12 days' notice. Brock was 12 years old the morning the county deputy drove out to their place and stood in the front yard with papers, while his father stood on the porch looking at something none of the rest of them could see. He never forgot the sound his father made when he signed. Not a shout, not an argument. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The sound of a man losing the only version of his life he had ever planned on living. Brock Steele had spent the 40 years since that morning building an operation so large and profitable and publicly successful that no bank and no drought and no quiet deputy with a folder could ever reduce him to that porch again. Bigger meant safer to him. Heavier genetics meant more revenue. More revenue meant more distance between himself and the memory of his father's signature on that transfer deed. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one. That is a distinction worth keeping. But fear, when it wears the costume of success, for long enough becomes indistinguishable from arrogance from the outside. And by the spring, this story begins. Brock Steele had been wearing that particular costume for so long that he may have forgotten on most days what was underneath it. The culture he built around Steele Summit had spread across Concho County, the way successful cultures always spread. Through imitation, through social pressure, through the simple and powerful human instinct to follow whoever looks like they are winning. Other ranchers began making the same decisions he made. Imported genetics from northern breeding programs, heavy frame performance bulls, maximum weaning weights measured and compared and bragged about at every feed store and auction barn between Midland and San Angelo. Feed conversion charts replacing older methods of observation. Cattle selected for how they looked on a trailer, rather than how they behaved in a drought. It worked. For a while. When weather cooperated and hay was cheap and cattle prices stayed strong, the numbers looked extraordinary. Brock's calves outsold nearly everyone else at auction. His photographs appeared in publications. Young ranchers studied his breeding decisions the way young athletes study professionals. Even the bank treated him differently than it treated everyone else, which is exactly how banks treat men who borrow large amounts of money and service their loans without difficulty. Willa Donovan watched all of this from 14 miles away and kept reading Earl's notebooks. She never tried to argue with the direction the county was moving. People misunderstood that silence. They thought it meant she had nothing to say or nothing to offer. But Willa came from the kind of ranching lineage that learned long ago the essential truth of weather country. Talking does not change what the sky is planning. Only preparation does. Every morning before first light, she walked the pastures with Earl's thermos in one hand and a notebook tucked under her arm. Not always writing, often just watching. The way grass recovered after grazing pressure. The way her cattle moved in heat versus how they moved in cool mornings. The way Solomon, since she had brought him home, traveled the north pasture in a way that told her something about the land she had not fully understood before. The Rio Flats livestock auction ran 3 times a year in a long metal building 8 miles south of town. The roof collected afternoon heat the way a Dutch oven collects cooking temperature. Dust floated in bars of sunlight between old wooden boards overhead. The auctioneer worked from a raised platform above a ring lit by industrial lights that made every animal look slightly more dramatic than it was. By 11 that morning, the building was packed from the entrance to the back wall. Brock Steele had taken a position near the front rail before 10. Around him, a loose circle of younger ranchers had formed the way circles always form around men who project certainty. The conversation ran where it always ran at these gatherings. Who had the best bull coming? Which northern strain had the strongest recent growth data? What the feedlots were paying per pound in the current market cycle. The performance bulls came through early. Massive animals, most of them over 2,000 pounds, moving through the ring with the specific confidence of cattle that have never been asked to do anything except grow fast and demonstrate genetic superiority. The bidding was immediate and aggressive. Numbers moved upward in large increments without hesitation. Brock paid $38,000 for a 3-year-old registered Angus bull from an elite northern program. The animal was remarkable looking by every current standard. Wide across the shoulders, heavily muscled through the hindquarters. The kind of bull that photographs well from any angle and makes other ranchers feel behind the moment they see it standing in a pen. The applause was genuine. Brock touched the brim of his hat and smiled with the ease of a man who has been watched for long enough that he no longer notices it. Wyatt sat 6 rows back and did the math he had already done a dozen times that week. $38,000 was more than Crackstone's entire operating margin for the previous year. He watched Brock receive congratulations from 3 different men in 30 seconds and felt the particular combination of frustration and inadequacy that comes from comparing your situation to someone else's at exactly the wrong moment. He had not wanted to come today. He had suggested they simply put the decision off until after the summer. His mother had already been in the truck when he came downstairs that morning. Willa was not watching the performance bulls. She was watching their breathing. Specifically, she was watching how each animal responded to the combination of heat and stress that came from moving through a crowded holding area and standing under auction lights in an enclosed space on a late May morning when the temperature outside was already climbing past 95. She made small notations in the margin of Earl's notebook with the pencil she kept behind her ear. Not evaluations of genetic potential or estimated weaning weights. Observations about cooling efficiency, stress response time, the particular way different body types managed heat load. She was looking for something specific, something Earl had written about more than once in more than one notebook, always in the same careful language. She found it in Lot 44. The bull that walked through the gate looked almost absurdly out of place beside everything that had come through the ring before it. Smaller frame, the kind of compact, efficient build that had been systematically bred away from over 30 years of performance-focused selection. His hide was faded in the way that South Texas sun fades everything. Eventually, a pattern of old color that spoke to years of outdoor exposure, rather than carefully managed conditioning. One horn slightly worn at the tip. A set of scars across his right shoulder from some long-ago fence encounter that had healed clean, but left its record. He moved into the ring slowly and placed each hoof against the dirt floor with the deliberate care of an animal that sees no particular reason to hurry. He was 8 years old. His name was Solomon. His bloodline traced to South Texas desert-adapted heritage stock that had been largely ignored by commercial programs for the past 2 decades in favor of faster-growing northern genetics. The laughter started before the auctioneer finished reading the sheet. A rancher near the front called something out about antiques. Another laughed loud enough to carry across half the barn. A man 2 seats from Wyatt muttered a remark to his neighbor that made the neighbor shake his head and look away, smiling. Even the auctioneer read the entry with a faint note of apology in his voice, the tone of a man acknowledging something everyone in the room has already decided. Wyatt looked straight ahead. Willa was not laughing, because she had already seen what she came to see. The performance bulls sold earlier had entered that ring blowing hard. Several had foam gathering at their mouths after the short walk from the holding pens, flanks heaving. Eyes showing the particular brightness of animals already pushing against their heat tolerance threshold. 40 seconds under the auction lights, and the stress was already visible in their bodies. Solomon was not breathing hard. His respiration was slow and even. His eyes moved around the barn with the relaxed alertness of an animal that was not expending unnecessary energy on anything. No panic. No waste. The heat in that building was identical for every animal that walked through the ring. But this one was inside it differently, not fighting it, not working against it, moving through it the way certain things move through difficulty that they were built to endure. Willa turned to a page near the middle of Earl's notebook, underlined twice in his careful black ink written years before during a summer, that tested everything on the ranch Earl had recorded. Something that sounded simple but had taken him years of watching to understand. The cattle that survive heat do not fight it. They conserve through it. She looked back toward the ring and kept watching. The bidding opened low and went lower before it went anywhere. 1,200. Silence. 1,000. Nothing. Someone near Brock's group called out 600 in the tone of a man making a joke at the auction's expense. The auctioneer looked across the barn with the patient expression of a man waiting for something to happen. Willa raised her card. The room shifted, not because of excitement, because people recognized who had just bid. 1,500, the auctioneer said, visibly surprised. Wyatt did not look at his mother. He fixed his eyes forward and kept them there, A rancher near Brock laughed openly across the space. "She buying retirement cattle now." Another voice came from the left side of the room. "That animal belongs in a history book." Brock Steele turned from the rail and looked back through the barn until he found her sitting there, with Earl's notebook across her lap and her card still raised. His expression was not mean-spirited. It was something more dismissive than that. The look of a man who has already sorted the thing he is looking at into a category that requires no further consideration. He shook his head once and turned back toward the ring. A second bidder offered $1,800 with the casual energy of someone placing a bet. They do not care about losing. Willa raised her card before he finished the number. 2,000. The man shrugged and stepped back. He had never really wanted the animal. He had bid the way some people laugh at things not because it was funny, but because the group was laughing and it was easier than standing apart. Nobody else moved. The auctioneer surveyed the barn slowly. The laughter continued in pockets along the rail and in the back rows where men were already looking toward the concession stand. 2,000 going once. Brock spoke clearly enough for a wide radius to hear. "Lady just bought herself a dead bloodline." The laughter that followed had a particular quality. Not cruel exactly, more like the comfortable sound of consensus. The sound of a room agreeing on something without anyone having to make the argument. Then Willa looked at Brock Steele, not with anger, not with the defensive heat of someone who has been insulted and needs the room to know they felt it. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they already understand completely and have no need to argue about. She said just one thing. "That bull has been breathing easier than anything in this barn today." Brock's smile did not disappear, but it lost its ease for just a moment, because somewhere underneath the $38,000 purchase receipt and the magazine profiles and the practiced confidence of a man who has spent decades being publicly right, there was still a 12-year-old boy who understood weather country better than any of the numbers on his breeding charts. He looked away without responding. The auctioneer brought the gavel down. Solomon was hers. The loading was quick and without ceremony. Wyatt walked beside Willa toward the truck without speaking until they had passed the last cluster of ranchers near the entrance. Then he said it quietly the way a son says something he knows is wrong to say, even as he is saying it. $2,000, Mom. Willa watched Solomon walk steadily through the loading chute ahead of them, moving through the heat of the open yard without breaking his pace or changing his breathing. "Watch how he walks out there," she told him. Wyatt watched for a moment. "Then he's old." She shook her head. "He's efficient." Wyatt put his sunglasses on. He did not respond. But before they reached the truck, he looked back one more time. Solomon stood in the trailer visible through the side slats, not pacing the way stressed animals pace in enclosed spaces, not working himself against the heat, just standing in the afternoon sun with the settled patience of something that has lived long enough inside difficult conditions to stop being afraid of them. That image stayed with Wyatt longer than he expected. 2 days after the auction, Jeffrey Keller drove out to Cracked Stone in a truck too clean for the road that led to the front gate. He arrived just after 8 in the morning, which told Willa something before he stepped out of the cab. People who arrive at that hour with that particular energy have news they want to deliver, before the other person has fully established the rhythm of their day. It is an old negotiating habit that most people who practice it do not realize they are practicing. Willa met him at the gate and led him to the porch table without offering coffee. Jeffrey had his folder. He always had his folder. This one was thicker than usual, and he held it differently than he normally held it, pressed against his side, rather than open and ready. The way folders get held when the person carrying them already knows the conversation is going to be difficult. He straightened his papers twice before speaking. "There are some structural changes at the bank level." He began that I need to walk you through regarding the operating line. Willa sat across from him at the table where Earl used to read weather reports on summer mornings. She waited without helping him get to it. Jeffrey cleared his throat. First Prairie has restructured its agricultural lending portfolio this quarter. Operating lines below certain collateral thresholds are being placed on enhanced review for renewal. Cracked Stone's current line falls below the adjusted threshold as of this revaluation cycle. Say it plainly, she told him. Jeffrey shifted once in his chair. The bank extended a significant new credit facility to a major regional operation last month. Part of the portfolio restructuring tied smaller adjacent loans to overall regional performance benchmarks. Your operating line is up for renewal in 60 days. Under the new benchmark requirements, the line will not be renewed unless the ranch demonstrates expanded collateral value within that window. The words landed on the porch the way certain words land. Not dramatically, just heavily. The way things land when they are real. Willa looked past him toward the west pasture, where the heat shimmer was already rising off the dirt, despite it being barely past 8 in the morning. The bank approved $2.8 million for Steel Summit, she said, and used the regional small loan portfolio to structure the leverage. Jeffrey's expression did not change in any obvious way. That transaction is above my level of authorization. She looked back at him then. 60 days, he continued. Options include expanding the breeding program on a production note leveraging land value for a development instrument, or demonstrating herd equity through documented growth. In plain English, she said. He folded his hands on the folder. Borrow more, grow faster, or face non-renewal. The morning continued around them on all sides. A scissor-tail flycatcher worked the fence line near the water trough. Somewhere in the north pasture, Solomon moved steadily through the early heat. From the road came the faint sound of a truck passing a quarter-mile away. Willa had seen the shape of this situation in Earl's notebooks before she had ever seen it in real life. Not this specific conversation, but the underlying pattern of it. The way institutional money eventually creates conditions favorable to its largest customers, not through outright malice necessarily, but through the simple logic of its own self-interest. Earl had written about it in 1994, in 1998, in 2007. The details were different each time. The structure was identical. She stood from the table without raising her voice. I will give you an answer before the 60 days are up. Jeffrey drove away slower than he had arrived. Wyatt had been in the barn during the conversation. He came through the gate while the dust from Jeffrey's truck was still settling on the Kalash Road, and the way he was walking told Willa he had heard enough through the open barn window to understand the shape of what had just happened. He stood beside her at the fence rail. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke. We could expand the herd on a production loan, he said. The fall calf market is historically strong in this region. If we time the breeding rotation correctly and document herd expansion by week 8, we can demonstrate the collateral growth before the deadline hits. Willa was looking at the north pasture. It is the only path that closes in time. Wyatt continued. The land value option requires a surveyor certification and probably 3 months of process. We do not have 3 months. She turned and walked toward the barn. He followed because he did not know what else to do. Inside, the air was 10 degrees cooler and carried the smell of old timber and dry hay and the particular dust of a working structure that has been used hard and maintained carefully for 60 years. Willa went to the long wooden shelf along the east wall, where Earl's notebooks stood in chronological order, spines facing out labels in his handwriting. She ran her hand along the row without speaking. Wyatt stood in the barn doorway with his hands in his pockets, and his weight shifted back on his heels the way he stood when he was preparing to be patient with something he found difficult to be patient with. Willa pulled the fifth notebook from the right, 2004 through 2007. She opened it near the back where Earl had written in the compressed hand he used when he was working through something quickly. She read to herself without speaking for a moment. Then she closed it and held it against her chest. Your father used to say something, she told him. Wyatt exhaled slowly. What did he say? She looked at the row of notebooks on the shelf. He said debt turns good years into promises and bad years into funerals. The barn was quiet enough that the birds outside carried clearly through the old wood walls. Wyatt removed his hat and held it in both hands. He was not disrespectful. He was genuinely frightened. Mom, we do not have the luxury of principals in a 60-day window. The bank is structured to call that loan. This is not abstract. Willa turned and looked at him directly. Start with the 2001 notebook, she said. Read forward from there. Do not skip the summer sections. She walked out of the barn into the morning heat and left him standing among the notebooks in the cool shade. He stood there longer than he expected to before he reached for the first one. That evening, when the work was done and the last orange light had left the Concho County horizon, Willa sat at the kitchen table beneath the warm yellow bulb Earl had always insisted on, 3 notebooks open in front of her, and 2 more stacked beside the salt shaker. She had eaten without tasting the food and started reading before she finished clearing the plate. She was not looking for anything specific. She was doing what she had done 1,000 evenings since Earl died, staying close to his thinking, finding the particular comfort of a voice she trusted in language she had read so many times. The pages fell open to familiar passages on their own. She moved through the middle volumes slowly. 1998, 2002. The drought years, the recovery years, the observations about which cattle handled stress well, and which ones revealed their fragility the first week. Conditions changed. All of it consistent. All of it pointing in the same direction he had been pointing for 20 years. She was reaching for the second to last notebook when the folded page fell from between its leaves and landed on the table. Not a full notebook entry. A single sheet of ruled paper, folded carefully into thirds thin from being folded and unfolded more than once. The handwriting was smaller than Earl's usual hand and slightly uneven in the way writing gets when a man is tired, or the light is not quite right, or he is trying to get something said before the moment that is allowing him to say it passes. She looked at the date written at the top. 7 days before he died. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Texas night had settled completely, and the insects had started their sound coming through the screen window in the back wall, in the steady way that sound comes when it has nowhere else to be. She read it slowly. Earl had been noticing changes in his energy for several months. He had not told her because he believed with the particular stubbornness of men who have ranched through hard things that rest and time would be sufficient. He understood now that he had been wrong about that. He was not afraid of what was coming. He wanted her to know that specifically. Not afraid. Only sorry about the timing. Sorry about the south fence section he had meant to rebuild for 2 years. Sorry about leaving in the wrong season. Then the handwriting steadied, became more deliberate. He wrote that he had been thinking about the ranch's long-term security for several years. Not about the cattle. Not about the grass or the water or any of the things that filled his notebooks. About the specific vulnerability of small family operations when weather turned hard and institutional money moved in one direction. He had watched it happen to 3 ranches in the region over the previous decade. He had recognized the pattern early enough. He had not wanted to wait. 18 months before he died, Earl had contacted the West Texas Agricultural Land Trust. Over the 14 months that followed, he had completed the documentation for a conservation land trust arrangement, signed and witnessed and filed, that would protect Crackstone Ranch from forced sale or foreclosure proceedings for 25 years. The paperwork was in the green strongbox inside the ranch safe. She had the combination. She had always had it. She had not opened the safe since the afternoon of his funeral. Not because she forgot the combination, because opening it meant finishing the last business of a man she had not been ready to stop grieving. And every time she stood in front of that safe in the years since the combination stayed in her memory, and her hand stayed at her side, and she turned back toward the kitchen and the notebooks, and the particular way of surviving loss that she had built without quite planning to. Willa set the page flat on the table. She sat with the quiet of the kitchen for a long time. The overhead light hummed faintly the way it always had. The insects continued outside. Down the hall, the line of light under Wyatt's door had gone dark an hour ago. She thought about 60 days and the look on Jeffrey Keller's face when he held his folder against his side. She thought about Solomon moving through the afternoon heat at the auction yard without a single sign of urgency. She thought about Brock Steele's $38,000 bull standing at Steel Summit tonight, in a holding pen somewhere, breathing hard in the Texas heat, built for everything except the summer, that was already moving toward Concho County, like something that had decided not to wait. She folded Earl's private page along its original creases. She held it for a moment against the back of her left hand. Then she placed it gently inside the front cover of the last notebook he had ever kept, and she closed it. She looked down the hallway toward the dark line under Wyatt's door. He would find out about the safe when the time came for it to matter most. Outside, the Concho County night was enormous and still, and the stars over West Texas burned with the indifferent clarity of things that have been burning longer than any of the arguments being made beneath them. Out in the north pasture, Solomon stood in the darkness without urgency, his old body settled into the land, the way certain things settle when they have belonged to a place long enough to stop being separate from it. Not impressive by any standard the county currently valued, not expensive, not something that would ever appear in a livestock magazine. Just built precisely and without apology for exactly what was coming. The second week of July arrived without warning in the way that dangerous things often arrive, not with drama or announcement, but with a simple and permanent change in the quality of the air itself. One morning, the sky over Concho County was still blue at the edges, the way Texas sky is supposed to be blue. And the next morning, it was white from horizon to horizon. The color burned out of it, the same way color burns out of fabric left too long in direct sun. Not a cloud, not a variation, just white heat pressed flat against everything beneath it, like a lid settling over a pot. The ranchers who had been watching weather for 40 years recognized it immediately. Not a heat wave, not a bad week, a dome. The kind of atmospheric event that does not pass in 3 days or 5 days or a week. The kind that sits and intensifies and reveals with the patient indifference of geology exactly which things in its territory were built to last, and which things only look that way during easier seasons. By the third day, the nighttime temperature stopped dropping below 92 degrees. Cattle that had been grazing normally through June stood at water tanks for hours past their usual evening patterns. Windmills turned without pause in the dry, moving air. Stock pond levels dropped visibly each morning, the waterline drawing back from its previous mark, the way a tide recedes except that no tide was coming back. Willa Donovan rose before 4 each morning during that stretch, earlier than usual. She dressed in the dark kitchen and walked the pastures before sunrise with Earl's thermos and a flashlight. She only needed for the first 15 minutes, before the Texas sky began its pale gray transition to another white day. She watched her cattle the way Earl had taught her to watch them, not for obvious signs of crisis, but for the small preliminary signals that come before crisis. the ones that look like nothing until you know what nothing actually looks like. Solomon moved steadily through the pre-dawn darkness each morning, covering the north pasture in his slow and efficient pattern. He did not bunch with the other cattle near water. He did not stand panting at the tank before the heat had properly arrived. He grazed in the early hours, rested during the worst of midday, and moved again in late afternoon with the same unhurried pace Willa had watched since the auction. Conserving, always conserving. His body managing heat the way old machinery manages hard use, not by pushing through it, but by distributing it across the whole system without concentrating it anywhere long enough to cause damage. She recorded everything in the margins of Earl's notebooks the way he had recorded everything in them for 44 years. Temperatures, behavior, breeding progress, water consumption estimates, recovery time after afternoon heat exposure. Across the county, things were moving in a very different direction. At Steel Summit, Brock's $38,000 bull had stopped covering cows by the second week of July. The animal stood in whatever shade his pen offered from mid-morning onward sides, heaving head low, the particular posture of a large-bodied creature whose internal temperature has exceeded its management capacity. Feed consumption dropped. Body condition began declining at a rate visible week over week. The bull had been built for maximum growth performance under controlled conditions with consistent nutrition and managed heat protocols. The Concho County heat dome was not a controlled condition, and it did not follow any protocol. The veterinarian at Steel Summit was a contract service out of Midland, young, competent, trained on modern production systems. He diagnosed heat stress accurately and recommended cooling protocols, shade extension, electrolyte supplementation, reduced activity during peak temperature windows, standard responses to a recognized problem, all of them correct in the context they had been taught in. None of them sufficient against a heat event that was not peak, that was not temporary, that was simply the new daily condition without a foreseeable end. Brock stood in his breeding pen one evening, watching the bull stand motionless against the fence line, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not anger. Not the productive frustration that drives aggressive men to aggressive solutions. Something older and quieter and more frightening than frustration. He felt the particular helplessness of a man who has bet everything on a system and is watching the system fail in a way that no amount of money or will or industry expertise can correct in the time available. He called his genetics supplier in Montana. The conversation went poorly. He called a production consultant in Amarillo. That conversation went worse. He spent $2,000 on additional cooling infrastructure in a single afternoon and watched his cattle stand in the shade he built without any meaningful improvement in their heat response. Because the problem was not shade. The problem was fundamental. These animals had been designed by generations of selection pressure for an environment that was no longer the environment they were standing in. Nobody was saying that out loud yet, but the thought was moving through Concho County feed stores and coffee conversations in the way thoughts move when they are too frightening to speak directly sideways and quietly, and between the actual words of conversations that were officially about other things. At Cracked Stone Ranch, the 60-day deadline from the bank was now 31 days away. Willa was aware of the number each morning when she woke before 4. She thought about the safe at the end of the hall the way you think about something you know you will eventually open, but are not ready to open on anyone else's timetable. She was working through it at her own pace for her own reasons, and she was not willing to be rushed into that room by Jeffrey Keller's folder or Wyatt's spreadsheets. Wyatt was struggling. That is the honest way to say it. He was a capable and intelligent man who had inherited from his father a genuine love for that specific piece of West Texas land, and from his own experience a thorough understanding of the financial mechanics that were at this moment pressing against the ranch from the outside. He had the documents from the bank memorized. He had run the numbers through every configuration that his engineering-trained mind could construct. He understood the deadline in a way that produced in him a low, persistent anxiety that he carried through every working hour. He also had 9 of Earl's notebooks stacked beside his bed. He had been reading them each night after dark, starting from 2001, the way his mother had told him to start moving forward through the years in his father's handwriting. He was not reading them the way he read engineering reports. He was reading them the way people read things when they are looking for a voice they miss in a place where that voice still exists. He had not told his mother he was doing this. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of July when Wyatt drove into Barnhart for mineral blocks and chain links and came home 3 hours later than the errand required. Willa was repairing the East Trough connection when she heard his truck come through the gate, and something in the sound of how he drove the speed, the particular arc of the turn he made in the yard, told her before she saw his face that something was wrong in the specific way that wrong things feel when someone has done something they cannot undo. She set down her wrench and waited. Wyatt sat in the truck for a moment after he parked. Then he got out and came toward her, and the look on his face was not defiance, and it was not arrogance, and it was not the stubborn argument she had learned to read in him over the past 4 years. It was something much more difficult to work with, the look of a man who has done a wrong thing for a right reason and already knows that neither fact changes the other. He had sold 7 cows, not randomly. He had sold 7 of the younger desert line cows from the breeding herd, the ones with the documented heat-adapted bloodline that Solomon had been covering through the breeding rotation. He had called the broker from Barnhart while he was in town, arranged the transaction while standing in the parking lot behind the feed store, and deposited the proceeds directly against the bank operating note before he drove home. $14,000 against the deadline. A month and a half of breathing room in his calculation. He told her standing in the ranch yard in the afternoon heat, with the dust from his truck still settling around them both. Willa did not raise her voice. This is worth noting because people who do not raise their voices when they have reason to raise them are sometimes misread as accepting the thing that was done to them. She was not accepting anything. She was processing it with the specific kind of controlled silence she had learned in 46 years of ranching through conditions that did not improve, because you shouted at them. She walked past him into the barn. He followed. Inside, she went to the breeding records she kept in the wooden cabinet behind the feed scale. She opened the ledger and spread it on the workbench and placed her finger on the entry for Solomon's current breeding rotation. Then she showed Wyatt what he had removed. Not just $14,000 of cattle. Not just 7 animals from a herd of 86. He had removed 7 of the specific cows that represented the youngest and most heat-resilient documented breeding pairs in the rotation. The cows that Solomon's offspring would most benefit from genetically in the next 3 years. In a normal season, the loss was manageable. In this heat, in this specific summer, with the breeding window narrowing and the value of heat-adapted conception becoming the most critical factor on any ranch in Concho County, the 7 cows he sold represented a gap in the future of everything the ranch was trying to prove. He understood it as she showed it to him. She watched his face move through the stages of comprehension. The way a man's face moves when he is learning something that costs more than he realized. "I was trying to buy us time," he said. She closed the ledger. "You bought us 30 days and sold us 3 years. She turned and faced him directly. "What you do to one part of a system shows up in another part 6 months later. Your father wrote that in 2003. The barn held them both in its old silence. The heat pressed against the walls from outside. A fly moved in slow circles near the high window. "Those cows are gone," Wyatt said finally. "I cannot undo it." "No." "Then what do I do with that?" Willa picked up the ledger and returned it to the cabinet. She closed the cabinet door and stood with her back to him for a moment. When she turned around, her eyes were not the eyes of a woman who is winning an argument. They were the eyes of a woman who is tired of arguments and wants something more useful. "Tonight you finish reading the 2003 volume," she said. "Then you read 2007. Read the summer sections twice." She walked out of the barn. He stood in the thick, warm air with the smell of old hay and iron around him, and looked at the cabinet where his parents had kept their records for 30 years. He felt the specific loneliness of a man who has tried to help and made things worse, which is one of the more complicated forms of loneliness there is because it carries guilt and intention simultaneously, and neither one cancels out the other. He drove the 7 miles to Barnhart 3 days later to pick up a replacement part for the North Pasture water line, and found himself in the middle of a conversation he had not planned to be in. Hank Blackwood was standing near the mineral pallet at the back of Hollow Creek Feed Supply when Wyatt came through the door. Hank was 61 years old and ranched 3 sections north of the Barnhart Road, a third-generation operation he had grown aggressively over the past decade, following every major purchasing trend in the regional livestock market. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made his decisions based on the best available information from the sources he trusted, which were the same sources nearly everyone around him had been trusting. And those sources had been consistently wrong in ways that were only becoming clear now. Hank looked worse than he had the last time Wyatt had seen him in May. The weeks of heat had taken something out of him that showed in the way he stood, the way men stand when they are carrying more than physical weight across their shoulders. They exchange the brief and careful greetings of neighbors who share a county and a vocation, and are currently living through different versions of the same difficult season. Then Hank said something that Wyatt had not expected. "I need to ask you something directly," he said, the way people preface things when they have been rehearsing the preface. Wyatt waited. "First, Prairie sent someone out to assess my land values last week." He paused and looked at the floor for a moment before looking back up. "Man named Keller. While he was walking the east boundary, he said something about a regional consolidation analysis they were running. Mentioned 3 operations by name." Wyatt kept his expression steady. One of the 3 was cracked stone. The mineral pallet was very still. The ceiling fans turned overhead in slow and insufficient circles. Outside, a truck was pulling in from the road with the particular sound of diesel engines running hot. Wyatt asked Hank to tell him exactly what Keller had said, word for word as best Hank could remember it. Hank told him. The wording was careful and bureaucratic the way financial language is always careful and bureaucratic when it is carrying information that would not survive being said directly. But stripped of the careful language, the meaning was clear enough. First, Prairie was building a regional valuation profile on specific small operations in the county, not for loan restructuring analysis, for acquisition preparation. The bank was positioning to move quickly on foreclosure proceedings the moment those operating lines matured without renewal, and at least one buyer had already been identified for at least one of the properties on that list. Wyatt thanked Hank and bought the waterline part and drove home without the radio on. He told Willa that evening after supper, while the light was leaving the western sky over the Concho County mesquite flats, and the temperature had dropped from brutal to merely severe. He told her everything Hank had said, in the same careful order Hank had said it, without editorializing and without the "I told you" or "I should have." That would have been understandable, but were not useful. Willa listened without interrupting. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded on top of Earl's most recent notebook, and she looked at her son steadily while he spoke. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment that felt longer than its actual duration. Then she stood and walked down the hall. Wyatt heard the sound of the closet door in the back room opening. Then a pause. Then the sound of the combination lock on the safe turning through its sequence in the way combination locks turn when someone who knows the numbers does it from memory, without hesitation. She came back to the kitchen carrying a manila folder sealed with a rubber band that had dried and cracked from years of sitting in a metal safe in a room that got hot every summer. She set it on the table between them. She had known about this, he said. It was not a question. I found the letter 3 months ago. In one of the summer notebooks. Wyatt looked at the folder without touching it. Why didn't you open the safe then? Willa sat down. Because I needed to understand it in the right order. She looked at the folder for a moment. Your father did not leave things incomplete by accident. Wyatt looked at her. And now... She placed her hand flat on the folder. Now we know what Jeffrey Keller is using those 60 days to prepare for. He absorbed that. She watched him put it together. The way engineers put things together methodically. Each piece finding its structural position relative to the others. The bank's aggressive restructuring. The operating line deadline. The regional acquisition profile. The buyer already identified. All of it fitting into a single design that had been in progress long before Jeffrey Keller made his first visit to their porch in the spring. The folder from the West Texas Agricultural Land Trust was 47 pages. Earl had been meticulous. The arrangement was fully executed, witnessed by 2 parties whose signatures were notarized at a law office in San Angelo in 2021, 14 months, before his heart stopped near the south fence on an August morning when nobody was watching except the land itself. The protection term was 25 years. The documentation was current and registered with the county clerk. The land trust superseded any future foreclosure proceeding by operation of its own terms. The ranch was protected. Had been protected, Wyatt said slowly, for more than a year before the bank started building its acquisition case. Willa nodded once. They never knew about it. She shook her head. Your father was careful about who needed to know what. Wyatt sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he looked back at his mother, his expression had shifted in a way she recognized and had been waiting to see for a long time. Not relief exactly. Something underneath relief. Something that comes when a son who has been disagreeing with his mother finally understands that she was not being stubborn or sentimental or stuck in the past. That she was waiting on information she already had for a reason he was only now in a position to understand. He knew we'd need it, Wyatt said. Willa set both hands on the folder gently. Your father spent 44 years watching patterns, she said. He did not often need to be told twice. They sat together at the kitchen table in the yellow light, with the Texas summer pressing against the windows while Wyatt read through every page of the land trust documentation from the first signature to the last. Willa made coffee and refilled her cup twice and did not rush him. Outside, the night insects continued their invariable work. Solomon moved somewhere in the north pasture darkness without any urgency or alarm. At some point after midnight, Wyatt set the last page on the table and looked at his mother for a long time, without speaking. I owe you an apology, he finally said. More than one. She shook her head slightly. What you owe me is to read the rest of those notebooks. The hottest night of that summer arrived on a Wednesday in the first week of August. The Weather Service recorded the overnight low at Barnhart that night as 94 degrees a number. That sounds like data but does not adequately describe what it felt like to be alive on the surface of Concho County at 3 in the morning, when the air had no coolness left in it anywhere, and every breath was the same temperature as every other breath, and the ground itself radiated the accumulated heat of 72 consecutive days, back upward into the air, like an oven that had forgotten how to stop. Willa woke at 2:30 from a half-sleep that had not been restful, dressed quickly, and went out to the pastures the way she had gone out every pre-dawn morning for the entire summer. She walked the south section first. Her cattle were stressed, the kind of manageable stress that showed in their evening clustering near the troughs. But they were standing. They were breathing without obvious difficulty. The younger cows that Wyatt had sold were gone, and the gap in the rotation showed in the spacing of the breeding groups, a wound in the operational logic of the herd that would take time to address. But the remaining animals were holding condition better than anything she heard about from other operations in the county. She walked the north pasture fence toward where Solomon usually stood in the hours before dawn. She found him down. He was lying on his right side near the mesquite line, in the way cattle lie when they cannot stand. Not the resting posture of an animal choosing the ground, but the posture of something that the ground has claimed. His breathing was audible from 15 feet away. Not the slow, even respiration she had watched all summer. Labored. Slower between breaths than it should be. His eyes were open and he tracked her approach but did not attempt to rise. She knelt beside him and put her hand on his neck and felt the heat radiating through his hide in waves. She did not go back to the house for the phone. She went back to the house because he needed water and she needed help. And both of those things required her to move quickly across the dark ranch yard and up the porch steps and down the hall without stopping. She knocked twice on Wyatt's door and opened it. He was already partially awake the way people are in summers that do not allow deep sleep. "Bring 2 buckets and the long hose from the equipment shed," she said. "Solomon is down in the north pasture." Wyatt was dressed and through the back door in 4 minutes. They worked through the remainder of the night in the darkness beside the downed bull. Water applied carefully to the major cooling points, neck and shoulder, and along the inner legs. Willa talked to the animal in a low and steady voice that was not performing comfort, but actually providing it the specific tone of someone who has been present at enough difficult moments to know that sound carries its own form of support. Wyatt worked efficiently beside her without conversation, his hands learning the task without being instructed. Around 4 in the morning, Wyatt went back to the house and came back with Earl's 2 most recent notebooks and a flashlight. He sat in the dirt beside Solomon and read, while Willa continued the cooling work, his flashlight making a small circle of readable light against the August darkness. Neither of them spoke much. The night held them both in its enormous heat. Occasional lightning moved across distant cloud formations to the southwest that never produced rain. A coyote called once from the direction of the road and was not answered. Around 5, with the horizon beginning its gray transition toward another white day. Wyatt set the second notebook down on his knee and looked at the hill in front of him for a long time. He saw something in those last 70 pages that Earl had written, which he had missed in all the notebooks that came before it. Not because the information was hidden, but because he had not been ready to receive it until he was sitting in the dirt, in the worst heat the county had seen in 30 years, beside a struggling animal in the dark. The observations about large frame performance genetics and their compounding vulnerability under consecutive heat stress. The predictions about the direction of climate patterns in the region, written not as apocalypse or alarm, but as simple and careful extrapolation from what Earl had watched the land do over 4 decades. The notes about water behavior and grass recovery and the specific way certain older bloodlines retain their reproductive function under conditions that shut down everything that had been bred too far away from the original parameters of survival. He read the final entry Earl had written in that notebook before he moved to the last one. The handwriting was steady. Late 2022, after the ranch safe already held what Earl had put there to protect them. He wrote about the summer patterns he was tracking, about the 3 ranches in the county he had watched make the same mistakes in sequence, about the specific direction he believed the next decade of West Texas weather would take. and what it would do to operations that were running on the assumption of continued good conditions. At the bottom of the page, Earl had written one thing separately from the rest, slightly lower than the main entry, as if it came to him after he set the pen down and picked it up again. He wrote, "The land always gets the final vote. It voted for us once already. Make sure we are still worth it." Wyatt closed the notebook slowly. He looked at his mother kneeling beside Solomon in the gray pre-dawn, her hands moving steadily through the cooling work, her voice low and continuous, her back straight in the particular way her back was always straight when she was doing something that needed to be done regardless of how tired she was. He thought about the 7 cows he had sold behind her back. He thought about the arguments he had made at the kitchen table over 4 years. He thought about the morning at the auction when he sat rigid with embarrassment while the whole county laughed, and his mother sat with her pencil behind her ear and watched an old bull breathe. He set the notebooks down beside him in the dirt and went back to work without saying anything. There was nothing to say that the work did not already say for him. Solomon raised his head at 6:15. He held it up for 30 seconds, then let it rest again. But the quality of his breathing had changed. Slower, less effortful. The heat was still bearing down, but something in the animal's physiology had made a decision or completed a process or crossed some internal threshold back in the direction of equilibrium. By 7:20, as the sun cleared the eastern ridge and the temperature recommitted itself to its daily ambition, Solomon gathered his front legs beneath him. Paused in the particular way large animals pause before they ask their weight to rise, and stood. He stood without assistance. He stood without drama. He stood the way he always did, compact and deliberate and without wasted motion, and looked across the north pasture with the same alert calm that had distinguished him from the first morning Willa brought him home. Wyatt stood in the dirt and watched him. The relief that moved through him had layers to it. Solomon's surviving was one layer, and it mattered enormously. But underneath that layer was something Wyatt would not have been able to name 4 hours earlier. The kind of shift that happens in a person when they spend a night sitting in the dark, reading a dead man's handwriting beside a struggling animal, while the worst summer in 30 years presses down on everything around them. Something had been arranged differently inside him by morning. Some internal argument he had been having with himself for 4 years had finally run out of footing and given way. He picked up Earl's notebooks from the dirt and walked back to the fence rail where his mother was standing. They watched Solomon move slowly toward the water trough without speaking. Then Willa said quietly, "Your father wrote that the desert does not punish weakness. It only reveals it." Wyatt held the notebooks against his chest. He was talking about the cattle. She glanced at him once, among other things. The revelation about Jeffrey Keller came not through cleverness or investigation, but through the simple and uncontrollable tendency of small county life to circulate information at a speed that outpaces every attempt to contain it. 3 days after the night with Solomon, Willa drove into Barnhart for mineral supplements and a replacement valve fitting and stopped at Hollow Creek Feed Supply, where she ran into Darlene Riggs, whose husband farmed the section 2 miles east of the Barnhart turnoff, and whose social radius covered a significant portion of county conversation. Darlene asked after the ranch in the way neighbors ask after things when they genuinely want to know. They talked about the heat and the water situation and the condition of the grass along the county road. Then Darlene mentioned with the casual authority of someone sharing established fact, rather than rumor, that she had heard First Prairie was doing ranch evaluations in advance of what she called some kind of regional portfolio transaction. She had heard that evaluation figures for at least 4 properties were already being shared with outside parties. Willa bought the valve fitting and the mineral supplements and drove back to the ranch without stopping anywhere else. She did not call Wyatt. She drove to the gate parked. The truck walked to the porch, sat down at the table where she had sat across from Jeffrey Keller 3 months earlier, and thought about it for 45 minutes, with the specific, unhurried attention she gave to things that needed to be fully understood before they were acted upon. The shape of it was clear, had been suggested clearly enough by what Hank Blackwood told Wyatt 3 weeks ago. Jeffrey Keller was sharing operational and valuation data from client accounts with at least one outside party who was positioned to acquire those properties after foreclosure proceedings. Whether this rose to the level of legal violation or was simply an ethical failure dressed in technical compliance was a question for someone with a law degree. What was not in question was what it meant for Cracked Stone Ranch. She called Jeffrey Keller from the porch phone, not his cell, the branch number. She asked for him specifically and waited while the hold music played something instrumental and inoffensive for 90 seconds. When he came on the line, she told him she needed him to come to the ranch. Not this week. Tomorrow morning. She told him to bring whatever documentation he currently held for the Cracked Stone operating line, and she told him to be prepared to discuss the regional portfolio transaction that First Prairie was currently structuring with outside buyer participation. There was a pause on the line long enough to tell her everything she needed to know about whether her information was accurate. He said he would need to check his schedule. She told him his schedule would work fine. 9 o'clock tomorrow. She ended the call. She sat on the porch for another few minutes while the afternoon heat moved across the ranch yard. Invisible waves in the scissor-tail flycatcher worked the fence line near the east trough. The way it worked that fence line every afternoon, Solomon was visible at the far end of the north pasture, moving at his usual pace through the brutal heat without apparent distress. Then she went inside and took the land trust folder from the kitchen shelf where she had put it. After the night, Wyatt read it at the table, and she read through it once more from the beginning carefully. The way you read something you already know, when you want to be certain you have not missed the thing that matters most. She had not missed anything. Earl had not missed anything either. When Wyatt came in from the evening pasture check and found her at the table with the folder open, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her expression, and understood, without asking, that the situation had developed. She told him about the call. He sat down. She told him about Darlene Riggs and what Darlene had said. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Keller has been building the acquisition case for months." Willa nodded, while simultaneously telling us to expand on a production note or lose the line. Yes. He looked at the folder, which he may not know exists. She placed her hand flat on the cover, which he definitely does not know exists. Outside, the Texas night was preparing itself over the white-burn landscape of Concho County. 3 days before Jeffrey Keller would sit at that porch table again and discover that the property he had been quietly positioning for acquisition had been protected by a dead man's careful foresight for longer than First Prairie had been building its case. Across the county, Brock Steele's operation was bleeding money and breeding capacity in ways that were no longer contained to the feeding circles and local conversation, but were beginning to show in documented production numbers and loan covenant discussions. At Hollow Creek and other feed stores, the bragging had largely stopped. Men stood over coffee and asked different questions than they had asked in spring, and the questions sounded like the questions people ask when the thing they were most afraid of is already happening, and they are trying to understand how much of it is still ahead of them. But Willa Donovan sat at the kitchen table in the yellow light with Earl's notebooks around her and the land trust folder in front of her, and felt something she had not given herself permission to feel in a long time. Not triumph. She would not have recognized that as something worth feeling. Not even relief, not yet. Something quieter than either of those things. The specific feeling that comes when you have been carrying a weight for long enough that you have forgotten the weight is not part of your body. And then you set it down for a moment and recognize in the absence of the thing how long you have been carrying it. 44 years of Earl's attention to the land, the notebooks on the shelf, the safe in the back room that she had finally opened when the time came for it to matter. Solomon standing in the north pasture, darkness alive and steady, and built for exactly the conditions that were destroying every expensive assumption in the county. She was 68 years old, and the worst summer the county had seen in 3 decades was not over yet. The bank was coming in the morning, and outside in the black Texas night, the land that had known this family for 61 years continued its old business of being exactly what it had always been, patient and clear-eyed and completely indifferent to whatever story the people standing on it chose to tell themselves about what survived and what did not. Jeffrey Keller arrived at 9 o'clock the following morning in his clean truck, his folder pressed against his side, the way it was always pressed against his side, and parked in the ranch yard with the careful precision of a man who parks carefully when he is not certain what he is parking in front of. The morning was already hot in the way that all mornings had been hot since the dome settled over Concho County 6 weeks earlier. White sky, still air, the particular brightness that makes every surface look slightly overexposed. Willa was sitting at the porch table when he came through the gate. Wyatt stood to her left with his back against the porch post, arms loose at his sides. The land trust folder sat on the table between the salt shaker and the coffee cup. It was not hidden. It was not displayed. It simply sat there the way documents sit when the person who placed them has decided they no longer need to be protected from view. Jeffrey came up the porch steps and saw the folder before he saw anything else. Willa watched him see it. She had learned long ago to read the small, involuntary signals that people send when information they did not expect lands in front of them. The slight adjustment of posture, the fractional pause before the professional expression reassembles itself. He sat down across from her and placed his own folder on the table and folded his hands on top of it. She told him to open the land trust folder and read the cover page. He read it without touching it. His eyes moved across the text with the efficiency of someone who processes financial documentation regularly, which meant he understood what he was looking at within 15 seconds of starting. He looked up. "This was filed," he said. Willa nodded. "Notarized and registered with the county clerk. December 2021. Jeffrey was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shed its practiced professional warmth, and what remained underneath it was something more functional and considerably less comfortable. "How long have you had this?" She picked up her coffee cup. "Long enough." Wyatt spoke from the post. "The operating line deadline doesn't apply to a property under land trust terms. You know that." Jeffrey looked at Wyatt, then back at Willa. His folder sat untouched in front of him. For the first time since he had started visiting Cracked Stone Ranch in February, he looked like a man who had arrived at a destination that was not the destination he had been traveling toward. Willa set her cup down. "There is something else I need to ask you about." He waited. "Darlene Riggs told me something last week," she said, "and Hank Blackwood told my son something a few weeks before that." She looked at him steadily in the way she looked at things she had already fully considered, and no longer needed to think hard about while looking at them. "I'm going to ask you once plainly. Were you providing Cracked Stone operational and valuation data to a prospective buyer in anticipation of foreclosure proceedings?" The porch was very quiet. The scissortail worked the fence line below. Solomon was visible in the north pasture, moving through the heat in his usual pattern. Jeffrey's jaw moved once without producing words. Then he looked down at his folder. The answer was in that movement, Not in any word he said. In the specific way a man looks at the folder in his hands when he no longer knows what it is for. "I'm going to have a conversation with the branch manager this week," Willa said. "I am going to have it with the land trust documentation, and with whatever documentation Hank Blackwood is willing to provide about what was said during your visit to his operation." She paused. "Whatever happens after that conversation is between you and First Prairie. That is not my business. What is my business is that this ranch does not hear from you or from anyone at that bank about this operating line again until that internal conversation has been completed." Jeffrey stood. He picked up his folder. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been relieved of it in a way that was not entirely comfortable. He drove out of the yard slower than he had arrived. Wyatt came away from the post and sat down in the chair Jeffrey had vacated. He looked at his mother for a moment. Then he looked at the land trust folder between them. "Dad knew someone at the bank would eventually try this," he said. "Not Keller specifically. The pattern." Willa closed the folder gently. "Your father trusted land more than he trusted institutions." She smoothed the cover with one hand. He was usually right about both of them. The First Prairie Agricultural Bank placed Jeffrey Keller on administrative leave 11 days later, following an internal review initiated by a formal written complaint, filed jointly by Willa Donovan and Hank Blackwood, supported by a third rancher, whose name came forward during the process. The details of that review were not made public, which is the way institutions handle their internal failures when they would prefer the failures not become part of the regional conversation. But in Concho County, administrative leave and internal review do not require a press release to travel. They travel on their own through feed stores and coffee tables and ranch-to-ranch phone calls until everyone who needs to know already knows. The operating line at Cracked Stone Ranch was renewed without conditions by a different loan officer the following month. None of that was the thing that changed the county. What changed the county happened on the first Saturday of September at the Concho County Extension Hall, a long metal building outside Barnhart that served as the community gathering point for everything from 4-H competitions to county commissioner presentations to the occasional livestock education event that ranchers attended mostly to argue with each other about what they already believed. The parking lot that morning filled before 8 o'clock with trucks from 3 surrounding counties. People came because Dr. Sandra Pierce had sent a single-page notice to every ranching operation in the regional veterinary service area, announcing a presentation of summer heat stress data and livestock breeding outcomes from the preceding 12 weeks. The notice was factual and plain and did not advertise anything beyond what it said. It did not need to. By August, every rancher in the region understood that the summer had been a diagnostic event. They came because they wanted to know what the diagnosis said. The hall filled past its comfortable capacity. Folding chairs covered every inch of floor space. Men stood along the back wall 3 rows deep. Women who ranched alongside their husbands or on their own operations sat in the front sections and in the rows along both side walls. The ceiling fans moved the heat around without reducing it. At the front of the room, a projector screen hung between 2 large windows. On the presentation table in the center beside the laptop and the pointer sat 3 of Earl Donovan's composition notebooks. Willa sat 7 rows back in the same faded denim shirt she wore to the Rio Flats auction in May. Wyatt sat beside her. Hank Blackwood had found a seat near the front and was studying the floor with the concentrated attention of a man preparing himself for information he already partly knew. Brock Steele was in the back row against the wall. He had come alone. He was not performing composure. He simply stood there with his hat in his hands and looked like what he was, a man who had not slept well in 6 weeks and was not certain what the next hour was going to require of him. Sandra Pierce stepped to the front of the room at 9 o'clock. She was 38 years old, and she had spent the entirety of the previous summer driving roads across 4 counties in early morning and late evening heat, checking cattle that were failing in ways that nothing in her graduate training had quite prepared her for at the scale she encountered. She looked tired and precise, and entirely uninterested in softening anything she was about to say. She began without preamble. This summer's heat event was not an anomaly, she said. The room was quiet. It was a data point on a trend line. The significance of that distinction is that anomalies do not require operational response. Trend lines do. She moved through the first set of graphs. Regional temperature averages over 3 decades. The pattern was visible without requiring interpretation. Summers staying hotter longer. The recovery period between extreme heat windows shortening year by year. The data was public record available from any weather station in the state. She was not presenting a theory. She was presenting a sequence of measurements that said what they said, regardless of what anyone in the room preferred to believe. The second set of graphs was where the room began to change. Pregnancy rates by operation type for the preceding 12 weeks. She had organized the data by herd composition, specifically by the proportion of large frame performance genetics versus older adapted bloodline genetics in each operation's active breeding population. The results were not ambiguous. Operations running predominantly performance genetics had lost between 31 and 58% of expected conception rates during the heat event. Operations running predominantly adapted bloodlines had lost between 4 and 12%. The murmur that moved through the room was not loud. It was the specific sound of a large group of people processing information that confirmed something they had been afraid to say out loud. Sandra changed the slide. Heat recovery data. Bulls sorted by frame size and genetic origin. The column showing recovery time after peak heat exposure for large frame performance stock was 3 to 4 times longer than the corresponding column for compact heat-adapted animals. During a breeding cycle, that recovery difference was not merely inconvenient. It was functionally catastrophic. A bull that requires 72 hours to recover breeding capacity after an afternoon of extreme heat cannot cover his rotation in a summer that doesn't have a cool afternoon for 6 consecutive weeks. Brock Steele was looking at that slide with his hat held in both hands in front of him, like a man holding something he was not sure belonged to him anymore. Sandra set the pointer down and picked up the first of Earl's notebooks from the table. "I want to tell you about where some of this data came from," she said. She had driven out to Cracked Stone Ranch in the second week of August. She explained to conduct pregnancy checks the same way she had conducted them at every other operation in the service area. What she found at Cracked Stone had been different enough from everything else she had seen that she asked Willa Donovan if she could review the operational records for context. Willa had given her the notebooks. Sandra held the composition book open to a page dated 2011 and placed it under the document camera. Earl's handwriting appeared on the projection screen, magnified to a size the whole room could read. The specific passage she had marked described heat stress observations during a difficult July that year, cross-referenced with breeding outcomes and body condition records for individual animals. The language was plain and careful and 20 years old, and it described exactly the pattern that Sandra's own data from the summer of 2023 had documented. Large frame bulls require 16 to 24 hours longer recovery after heat load, in excess of 98 degrees, Earl had written. Compact heat-adapted animals in the same herd under identical conditions show no measurable breeding disruption at the same exposure level. Recommend against further expansion of large frame genetics in this climate zone. The room held that in its silence for a moment. Sandra changed the page on the document camera. 2007 Notebook Summer Section. Earl's handwriting again. She read one passage aloud in her practical, unornamented voice. The passage predicted in the careful language of a man extrapolating from direct observation, rather than modeling software the exact convergence of heat pattern and breeding system vulnerability that had just spent 12 weeks dismantling the assumptions of every modern operation in the county. Several men along the side wall were looking at the floor. Two women in the fourth row were leaning together quietly. Hank Blackwood had not raised his eyes from his boots in several minutes. Sandra set the notebook down. Earl Donovan was not a scientist, she said. He did not have a graduate degree in animal physiology or climatology. What he had was 44 years of paying attention to one piece of land and writing down everything it told him without deciding in advance what it was allowed to say. She looked at the room. Every data point in my regional breeding analysis from this summer is consistent with observations he recorded between 1989 and 2022. Not occasionally consistent. Consistently consistent. The only operation in this county that performed within normal breeding parameters during a 50-year heat event was the operation that has been quietly managing toward the conditions he predicted. In notebooks, nobody asked to read. Now, let me pause here because what happens in rooms when communities confront the gap between what they mocked and what saved them is not a simple thing. It is not clean or comfortable or dramatic in the ways that dramatic moments are supposed to be dramatic. It is quiet and specific, and it moves through people differently, depending on how much they have personally invested in the assumptions that are being revised. What moved through the Concho County Extension Hall that morning was something heavier and more durable than embarrassment. It was the particular weight of reckoning, not punishment, reckoning. The kind that comes when reality finishes making its case and the people on the other side of the argument finally stop arguing. After the formal presentation ended, people did not leave quickly. They gathered in the way that people gather when a conversation needs to continue, but has not yet found its proper form. Around Sandra near the data tables, along the sides of the room in pairs and small groups, Willa stayed seated for a while as people came to her in the cautious way that people approach something they were recently dismissive of, with the particular combination of respect and discomfort that genuine admission of error produces. Hank Blackwood was the first rancher to come to her directly. He came with his hat in his hands and stood in front of her and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. She waited for him without helping him. "I laughed at that bull," he finally said. She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know I understand what that means now." He exhaled slowly. "Not just about the bull." Willa stood and extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was the grip of a man who has been doing hard work for 6 decades and knows the difference between a handshake that is polite and one that is sincere. "I would like to talk to you about rebuilding my breeding rotation," he said. She nodded. "Come out next week." There were others after Hank. Ranchers with questions that sounded like questions but were actually admissions. Requests that carried underneath them the unspoken acknowledgement that a direction had been wrong and a different direction was needed. Willa answered each one with the same quality of attention she gave everything direct and without ceremony, and without any impulse to remind people of where they had stood the last time they saw her. Wyatt watched all of it from the seat beside her. At some point, he stopped watching the people who came to speak with her and started watching her face while she spoke with them. The patience in it, the absence of any desire to be seen as vindicated. She was not collecting anything from these conversations. She was beginning something, planning the use of the next several years the way his father had planned the use of the land, with a long view and a steady hand, and no particular need for anyone else to understand what she was doing until it was already done. He thought about the 7 cows he had sold. He thought about them with a specificity that had not diminished since the morning he had told his mother what he had done in the ranch yard. He had been carrying that decision through every subsequent event: the night with Solomon, the discovery of the land trust, the meeting with Jeffrey Keller on the porch. He had not raised it again because there was no mechanism available for undoing it, and dwelling on it in conversation produced nothing useful. But he had been adding it to his own private accounting of what the summer had cost and what it had taught. And both columns were longer than he had expected them to be. The last person to approach Willa in the extension hall that morning was not a rancher. Sandra Pierce came and stood in front of her with the notebooks held carefully against her chest, and looked at her with the expression of someone who wants to say something and is taking the time to find the words that actually fit the thing. He built a monitoring system, Sandra said finally, out of observation and patience and 44 years of showing up. She looked at the notebooks. There is a university in Lubbock that would like to include this data in a regional adaptive livestock study. Willa looked at the notebooks. I would want the notebooks back, she said. Sandra nodded. Of course. Willa thought for a moment. Then she said he would have been glad the data was used. He was never trying to keep it from anyone. Nobody asked. Sandra looked at her carefully. Nobody asked because they thought they already knew. That is the way of it usually. Sandra pressed the notebooks gently toward her. Willa took them back and held them the way she had held them since August, in the crook of her arm against her side, close enough that she could feel their familiar weight at any moment she needed to. They drove back to Cracked Stone in the late morning while the heat settled into its daily depth across the Concho County landscape, and the mesquite flats turned their usual pale color, and the windmills on the horizon turned in a dry wind that moved air without cooling it. Wyatt drove. Willa sat with the notebooks in her lap and looked out the passenger window without speaking. At some point on the highway, Wyatt said, "You never wanted them to fail." She turned from the window. "What do you mean?" He kept his eyes on the road all summer. Everything that happened to the other operations. You were not waiting for it. She looked at the road ahead for a moment. No, you knew it was coming. She had known the shape of what was likely coming since the spring. She read Earl's 2007 entries again after 2 years of not needing to read them. She had not wanted it. She had not positioned herself to benefit from it. She had simply prepared for the conditions she believed were coming, and tried to stay solvent long enough for the preparation to matter. Your father spent the last decade of his life trying to tell people what he saw, she said. Not arguing, just offering. In conversations at extension meetings, in the way he managed the ranch, where anyone who looked closely could see what he was choosing and why. She set her hand flat on the notebooks. Most people were not ready to hear it. That was not a failure of their character. It was the way things move when money is working in one direction and the future is moving in another. Wyatt nodded slowly. He got ahead of the future. She looked back out the window. Your father always said you could not beat weather, but you could learn to run beside it. They turned onto the Calache Road, and the truck moved through the pale dust. The way trucks move on roads that know them without any particular announcement. Cracked Stone came into view, the way it always came into view from that angle. The old main barn visible first above the mesquite line, then the house. Then the long line of fence along the north boundary that Earl had maintained with the same consistency he maintained his notebooks. Solomon was in the north pasture. He moved the way he always moved in the late morning heat, slow and deliberate and covering ground at a pace that made sense to him, regardless of what pace the temperature suggested. His compact frame against the pale Texas landscape looked like something that belonged there, not placed, not managed, simply of a piece with the land that had shaped the bloodline he carried in the way that land shapes everything that lives on it long enough. Willa watched him from the truck window until he disappeared behind the barn as they pulled in. The evening that Brock Steele came was 3 weeks after the Extension Hall meeting in the last days of September, when the heat had finally begun its annual retreat, and the evenings in Concho County carried the first suggestion of cooler air that did not quite arrive yet, but was close enough to smell. The mesquite turned slightly in the early evenings. The scissor-tail flycatchers had started moving south. The cattle were grazing longer in the afternoons as the temperature dropped enough to make movement worthwhile. Willa was on the porch when his truck came up the road. She recognized it from a distance, but it did not move the way his truck usually moved. It came slowly, without the confident speed of a man who has decided something. It came the way trucks come when the person driving them has not entirely resolved whether they are doing the right thing. He parked on the far side of the ranch yard, which was not where anyone parked who came to see her, and sat in the cab for a moment before he got out. He was not wearing his usual starched shirt. He wore a plain cotton work shirt, the kind that does not photograph well and does not appear in magazine profiles. Faded from washing in the particular way that cotton fades when someone has been wearing it for actual work, rather than appearance. He was not carrying his truck keys or his phone. He was carrying a small cardboard box about the size of a shoebox, sealed with a piece of duct tape that had been applied and then removed and reapplied. He crossed the ranch yard without haste and came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped there. Willa did not stand or tell him to come up. She simply looked at him from the porch chair, in the even way she looked at things that required patience. He set the box on the step nearest him. "I found it when I was cleaning out the office last week," he said. He looked at the box. "Most of the stuff from May I threw out, but I kept this." He lifted the top flap. Inside, resting on a piece of brown paper, was the auction tag from Lot 44. Rio Flats Livestock. Auction late May, the year in question. The number printed in plain black on white cardstock, slightly bent at one corner. The way tags get bent when they are handled many times by many people in a single afternoon. Willa looked at it without moving from her chair. "I thought about sending it," he said, "or having someone drop it off." He straightened slightly. That felt like the wrong way to do it. She waited. Brock looked away from the box and out toward the north pasture, where the evening was settling through the mesquite and the cattle were moving in their leisurely end-of-day patterns. He was quiet for a while, in the way people are quiet when they have something prepared to say, but need to find the entry point. When he spoke again, his voice was different from the voice that had carried across the auction barn in May. Not softer exactly, stripped of something. The specific outer layer that men wear when they are performing certainty for an audience. "I grew up 40 miles north of here," he said. His eyes stayed on the pasture. "My grandfather started a dryland cotton operation in the 20s. My father tried to hold it through the 80s drought when prices collapsed and the bank called the note." He paused. "I was 12 years old when the county deputy came with the paperwork." Willa listened. "My father was not a weak man. He was a careful man who ran out of time." Brock was quiet for a moment. "I spent every year after that making sure I would never be where he was. Never give weather or a bank or bad timing enough room to put me on a porch, signing papers with no options left." He turned from the pasture and looked at her then. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man seeking absolution. It was the expression of a man finishing something that needed to be finished regardless of how it landed. "I built big, because big felt like distance from that porch," he said. "Every animal I bought that outweighed something else, every number I put in a magazine, every time somebody nodded at me across an auction barn." He shook his head slowly. "I thought I was building against the thing I was afraid of." He paused. "Turns out I was building the same thing in a different shape." just bigger and louder so I wouldn't have to look at it directly. He looked at the auction tag in the box. I laughed at that bull because he reminded me of the cattle my father kept when there was no money for anything else. The small old stock, the unfashionable kind. He exhaled. I laughed at what I came from because I did not want to think about what it meant that I came from it. The porch was quiet except for the evening birds. The light was going warm and low across the ranch yard. Willa stood from her chair slowly. She came to the top of the steps and looked down at him for a moment. Then she came down one step and reached past him and took the auction tag from the box and held it in her palm. "The cattle your father kept," she said. "Did they survive the drought that took the operation?" Brock looked at the tag in her hand. He was still for a moment. Then, "Yes, most of them." She nodded once. Then she looked at the tag. Earl used to say that old knowledge does not become wrong because new knowledge becomes fashionable, she said. It just becomes quiet until something happens that makes people listen again. She looked at him. "Your father's cattle survived because they were built for the land they were standing on. Same land you're standing on right now. Same land this tag came from." She held the tag for another moment. Then she placed it carefully in the front pocket of her denim shirt. He watched her do that. She looked at the north pasture where the evening was deep gold against the dry grass. Then she looked back at him. "Come up on the porch. I will make coffee." He came up the steps without the box. He sat in the chair that faced the north pasture, and Willa brought 2 cups and set one on the rail in front of him and kept one in her hand, and they sat in the cooling evening without any particular pressure to say anything further. After a while, Wyatt came out and saw Brock sitting there, and his expression moved through several stages before settling on something that resembled the peace of a man who has learned to let the world rearrange itself, without insisting on a particular shape. He got his own cup and came and sat on the steps. They watched the cattle in the last of the light. Solomon moved through the north pasture in his familiar pattern, his compact frame visible against the gold of the low sun, unhurried and steady, and completely unremarkable by any standard the county had valued 6 months ago. Brock looked at him for a long time. Then he said quietly, and without requiring a response, "I lost 41% conception this summer." He paused. 2 bulls permanently compromised. Wyatt looked at the pasture. Brock continued, "I have to rebuild from something." He was quiet. "I do not know what that looks like yet." Willa set her cup on the rail. "It looks like starting from what actually works in this climate," she said, "not from what works in a catalog." The 3 of them sat in the evening until the light was fully gone, and the stars came out over Concho County with their indifferent clarity. And the conversation moved in the way conversations move on porches in ranch country, when the pressure has gone out of them slowly, and without agenda about grass recovery and water table levels in the fall calf market, and the particular way the mesquite had held its leaves longer this year than last. Solomon died on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of November, 3 weeks after the first frost had moved through the county and laid its thin white cover across the pasture grass that had already been turning. He died the way he had lived, without urgency and without drama. Wyatt found him in the early morning lying on his side in the mesquite shade along the north fence line, with the open Concho County sky above him and the ranch in all directions around him. His eyes were closed. His body had the settled quality of something that had completed its work and stopped. Willa came out and stood beside him for a long time. The morning was cold and still. The cattle moved at a distance through the frost-pale grass. She did not try to characterize the feeling. It was layered in the way that losses are always layered when the thing you are losing carried more than its own weight. Solomon had carried Earl's judgment into the present. He had been the visible evidence of a decision made from knowledge that nobody around her was willing to take seriously. He had stood in the worst heat the county had seen in 30 years and come through it, and by coming through it had made an argument that no amount of explanation could have made as clearly. She knelt beside him and placed her hand on his neck, the way she had placed her hand on his neck, the night he almost did not survive August. Wyatt stood beside her. The frost was still on the grass. Neither of them spoke for a while. He earned the view, Willa said finally. They buried Solomon that afternoon in the shade along the north fence, where he had spent so many of his mornings, and where the mesquite filtered the afternoon light, in the particular way it filtered it there in long, pale bars across the ground. Wyatt worked the backhoe with the same concentrated care he brought to everything he had learned to do on that ranch in the months since the summer began. They buried him deep and marked the place with a flat stone they brought up from the dry creek bed below the south boundary. No ceremony, no particular words said aloud. Just the two of them standing at the north fence in the November cold, while the cattle moved through the background of the ranch in their usual morning rhythms. That evening, Willa sat at the kitchen table with Earl's notebooks around her, as she had sat so many evenings since his death. She opened the last one he had written to the final entry. She read it the way she had read it many times, slowly and with full attention, not looking for new information, but simply spending time in her husband's thinking. The passage about the land getting the final vote, the care in the handwriting, the steadiness of a man who had been paying attention to something long enough that the attention itself had become a form of peace. She turned to the inside back cover of the notebook. She had put the auction tag there 2 days after Brock's visit, sliding it carefully between the cardboard cover and the last page where it lay flat and undamaged, and no longer needed to be anything except what it was. A small piece of cardstock from a May afternoon when one quiet decision got laughed at by a county that had not yet been humbled into readiness. She closed the notebook gently. Outside, the Concho County night was cold for the first time in months. Clear and enormous. The stars doing their usual work above the dry Texas landscape without concern for what was happening below them. In the north pasture, where Solomon had spent 4 seasons proving what no argument could prove more efficiently than weather, the remaining cattle moved through the darkness as they always moved through it, slowly and without alarm, tended by bloodlines that had been shaped for this exact piece of the world over generations, that nobody had seen fit to document until Earl Donovan started watching and writing. The spring that followed was different in the ways that springs are different when a community has been through something that changed its frame of reference without changing its landscape. The same roads, the same feed stores, the same auction barns and county extension buildings and coffee machines in feed supply back rooms. But the conversations were different, not transformed, not idealized. Just different in the specific way that conversations are different, when the people having them have spent a difficult season being instructed by reality about the distance between what they believed and what was true. Hank Blackwood rebuilt his breeding rotation over the winter, using 3 replacement heifers from cracked stone and 2 desert-adapted bulls sourced from a heritage stock program in the Edwards Plateau region that he had previously never looked into, because he had never needed to. He was not the only rancher who made similar adjustments. He was simply the first one to do it openly, and the first one to mention Willa Donovan by name when asked why. Brock Steele spent the winter in a process he described to no one as reinvention, but that anyone watching his operation could have identified as exactly that. He sold the majority of his imported performance stock at a reduced price, rather than continue investing in cooling infrastructure and nutritional management for animals that required resources his land could not sustainably provide. He bought smaller. He bought from different programs than he had ever bought from before. He did not appear in any livestock magazine that year. He seemed to people who watched him to be somewhat lighter for the absence. In April, Grace Donovan drove up from Lubbock in a truck she had bought with the money from 3 summers of ranch work and a part-time position at the University Animal Science Laboratory. She was 21 years old, the daughter of Wyatt and a woman named Lynn, who had stayed connected to the ranch across the distance of a marriage that had ended 7 years earlier, in a way that left no particular damage behind. It only the specific kind of ongoing arrangement that sensible people make when they share a child they both love. Grace had her grandfather's eyes, not the color, the quality, the specific attentiveness of someone who looks at things long enough to see what is actually there, rather than what they expect to be there. She had asked Willa the previous fall if she could come for the spring semester and study the breeding program alongside her thesis work on heat-adapted livestock genetics. Willa had said yes without any particular ceremony and told her to bring practical boots. Grace arrived on a Wednesday morning with a duffel bag, a laptop, and a new composition notebook that she had bought at a drugstore in San Angelo because her mother had told her that was what her grandfather had always used. Willa made breakfast and they ate together at the kitchen table. And Grace asked questions about the breeding records, and Willa answered them and showed her the sections of Earl's notebooks that were most directly relevant to what she was studying. The morning moved the way mornings move in ranch kitchens when the work is waiting outside and the people inside know it and are making good use of the time before they go to it. After breakfast, Grace went out to walk the pastures before the day got properly hot. Willa stood at the kitchen window and watched her cross the ranch yard in the early light. The girl moved with the rancher's pace, not fast and not slow, but purposeful in the specific way that people are purposeful when the ground beneath their feet is familiar, at some level deeper than conscious memory. She had her composition notebook tucked under her arm, the way Earl had always carried his, not held, tucked, like something belonging there. She stopped at the north fence line and stood looking out across the pasture, where Solomon's grave was marked by the flat creek stone. She stood there long enough that Willa understood she was not just stopping. She was beginning something. Some quiet reckoning with a piece of the ranch's history that had been explained to her in words over the winter, but was now becoming real in the specific way that things become real only when you are standing where they happened. Then, Grace opened this composition notebook and wrote something down. Willa did not need to see what it was. She turned from the window and picked up her coffee cup and walked through the kitchen to the back door and out onto the porch where the morning was cold and clear, and the Concho County sky was doing its usual work above the pale land that Earl Donovan had watched for 44 years and had left behind in 44 notebooks, and in the shape of a ranch that had survived what most people in the county had believed it could not survive. The mesquite flats stretched west and south in the early light. The cattle moved through the north pasture in their morning patterns covering ground, in the unhurried way of animals that have been bred for this climate over generations long enough that the climate no longer frightens them. The windmill turned at the south boundary. The frost that had come in the night was already lifting off the grass as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Willa drank her coffee and watched Grace move further into the north pasture notebook in hand, stopping at intervals to observe and write in the same patient rhythm that had produced 44 years of data that a county had not known it needed until the summer it could not have survived without it. Legacy is not land. She had understood that for a long time. Land could be taken by banks and weather and the accumulated mistakes of a generation that trusted the wrong things. Legacy was something more portable and more durable than land. It was the particular way of seeing that survives in the person who was taught to see it, and in the person that person teaches in turn. and in the notebooks that carry the record forward through the years when no one is asking to read them yet. Earl had understood that. He had built accordingly. She finished her coffee and set the cup on the rail. The morning was warming slowly around the ranch the way mornings warm in West Texas, when the season has finally turned and the land is exhaling from the long tension of summer. A scissortail worked the fence line below the porch, its forked tail opening and closing in the still air, with the quick efficiency of a creature completely at home, in the only place it has ever needed to be. Out in the north pasture, Grace stopped walking, looked up from her notebook, and turned back toward the house. She saw her grandmother on the porch and raised one hand in a brief, unhurried wave. Willa raised hers in return. Then Grace turned back toward the pasture and kept walking, kept watching, kept writing down what the land had to say to anyone willing to stand still long enough to hear it.